The Oklahoma Territory stretched endless and unforgiving under the crimson sky of late autumn 1891, where the dreams of settlers met the harsh reality of land that demanded everything and promised nothing in return. Thomas McKenna had learned this lesson the hard way during his 8 years homesteading 40 acres of stubborn prairie that seemed determined to resist every attempt at cultivation. At 52, Thomas had the weathered hands and sun-beaten face of a man who had made his peace with solitude. His wife Sarah had been gone 3 years now, taken by the fever that swept through their small community like wildfire, leaving him alone with memories that felt both precious and unbearably heavy. The small farmhouse they had built together still echoed with her laughter in the quiet moments. But mostly, it held the profound silence of a man who had forgotten how to talk to anyone but his livestock and the wind. The day had been typical for late October, clear and cold, with the kind of bite in the air that warned of the harsh winter to come. Thomas had spent most of it repairing the chicken coop that a recent storm had damaged, working with the methodical patience of someone who understood that in this territory, neglected repairs could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red that still took his breath away after all these years, Thomas was securing the last of the wire mesh when he noticed the figure approaching from the east. At first, it was just a dark silhouette against the dying light, moving with the careful, measured steps of someone either injured or extremely cautious. Thomas straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that leaned against the fence post nearby. In the Oklahoma Territory, unexpected visitors could mean anything from a neighbor needing help to trouble that could end a man's life in the time it took to draw breath. But as the figure drew closer, Thomas realized his visitor posed no immediate threat, at least not the kind that came from hostile intent. It was a young Native American woman, probably no more than 18 or 19, walking barefoot across the rough prairie grass with obvious pain in every step. Her dark hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders, and her traditional dress was torn and stained with what looked like travel and hardship. But it was her eyes that struck Thomas most forcefully, large, dark, and filled with a wariness that spoke of experiences no young person should have to endure. She stopped about 20 yards from where Thomas stood, close enough for him to see the exhaustion etched in every line of her body, but far enough away to maintain a safe distance from this stranger whose intentions she couldn't know. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her torso, and Thomas could see her shivering in the evening cold, her breath forming small clouds in the increasingly frigid air. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space that separated them, two people from different worlds, each trying to read the other's intentions. Thomas had encountered Native Americans before, of course. The territory was still home to many tribes who had been relocated here from other parts of the country. But those encounters had typically been brief and formal, mediated by government officials or conducted in the context of trade. This was different. This was one human being encountering another in a moment of obvious need, stripped of all the complex political and cultural considerations that usually govern such meetings. The young woman was cold, injured, and clearly exhausted. Everything else, her race, her tribal affiliation, the potential complications that helping her might bring, seemed secondary to the simple, immediate reality of her suffering. Thomas made his decision with the same quiet certainty that had guided most of the important choices in his life. Without a word, he began to unbutton his heavy wool jacket, the only winter coat he owned and the one Sarah had mended for him countless times during their marriage. It was worn and patched in places, but it was warm and dry, and that was what mattered now. The young woman's eyes widened slightly as she realized what he intended to do. She took a small step backward, her body language suggesting she was prepared to run if necessary. But Thomas moved slowly and deliberately, his actions as non-threatening as he could make them. He held the jacket out toward her, not advancing or attempting to force the gesture, just offering what comfort he could provide. "It's cold," he said simply, his voice rusty from disuse but gentle. "You're shivering." For what felt like an eternity, she stared at him with those dark, searching eyes, as if trying to peer into his soul to determine whether this unexpected kindness was genuine or some kind of trap. Thomas stood patiently, his arm extended, the jacket hanging between them like a bridge across the chasm of mistrust that history had carved between their peoples. Finally, with movements as careful and deliberate as his had been, she stepped forward and took the jacket from his hands. The jacket seemed to swallow the young woman's small frame, its worn wool hanging nearly to her knees and completely covering her arms. She pulled it tight around her shoulders, and for the first time since Thomas had noticed her approach, her shivering began to subside. The relief in her posture was immediate and unmistakable, though her eyes never lost their careful watchfulness. Thomas gestured toward his farmhouse, a modest structure of weathered wood and stone that Sarah had always said looked like it grew naturally from the prairie itself. "There's soup," he said, keeping his voice low and non-threatening. "And coffee, if you're hungry." She tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the intensity of someone who had learned that survival, often depended on reading the true intentions behind a person's words. Thomas had the distinct impression that she understood English perfectly well, even if she chose not to speak it. After a moment, she gave the slightest of nods, not acceptance exactly, but acknowledgement of the offer. Thomas led the way to the house at a pace slow enough for her injured feet to manage comfortably. He noticed that she favored her left foot, and that there were small spots of blood on the ground where she had walked. The cuts looked fresh, probably from walking across the rough terrain in bare feet, and Thomas found himself wondering how far she had traveled and why she had been walking alone across the dangerous expanse of the Oklahoma Territory. The interior of the farmhouse was simple but clean, reflecting the orderly habits of a man who had learned to take care of himself after years of solitude. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace that Thomas had built with his own hands, and a wooden table that bore the careful craftsmanship of someone who understood that furniture had to last. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of Thomas and Sarah on their wedding day, and a few practical items like tools and cooking utensils. Thomas motioned for his guest to sit at the table while he ladled soup from the pot that had been simmering on the wood stove. It was a simple vegetable soup, made from the last of his fall garden and seasoned with herbs that Sarah had planted and that still grew wild around the house. As he worked, he was acutely aware of the young woman watching his every movement, her body positioned so she could see both the door and the window, ready to run if the situation demanded it. When he placed the bowl in front of her, along with a spoon and a thick slice of bread he had baked that morning, she looked at the food for a long moment before tentatively taking a taste. Her reaction was immediate, the warmth and nourishment clearly something her body desperately needed. She ate carefully but steadily, pausing occasionally to look up at Thomas, as if to reassure herself that this unexpected kindness wasn't some elaborate deception. Thomas poured coffee for both of them, noting that his guest's hands, while rough from outdoor life, were small and delicate, with long fingers that spoke of skilled handiwork. There were calluses that suggested she was accustomed to crafts requiring precision and patience, weaving, perhaps, or beadwork of the kind he had seen in the trading posts. "My name is Thomas," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her with sudden conversation. "Thomas McKenna." She paused in her eating, those dark eyes meeting his across the table. For a moment, he thought she might speak, might offer her own name in return. Instead, she simply nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and a kind of formal acknowledgement of his introduction. The silence that settled between them wasn't uncomfortable, despite its weight. It felt more like the natural quiet between two people who understood that some communications didn't require words. Thomas found himself thinking of the evenings he and Sarah had shared, sitting together by the fire with no need for constant conversation, content in each other's presence, and the shared understanding that comes from years of companionship. As the young woman continued to eat, Thomas noticed details he had missed in the fading light outside. Her dress, while torn and travel-stained, was beautifully made, with intricate beadwork and patterns that spoke of considerable skill and time investment. Her jewelry, a few simple pieces of silver and turquoise, was of high quality, suggesting that she came from a family of some means and status within her community. But most striking were her eyes, which held a depth of intelligence and strength that seemed far beyond her years. These were not the eyes of someone accustomed to being a victim, but rather of someone who had made difficult choices and lived with their consequences. There was something sacred about her bearing, something that reminded Thomas of the way Sarah had carried herself, with dignity that came from within rather than from external validation. When she finished eating, she pushed the bowl away slightly and looked directly at Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Then, slowly and deliberately, she touched her hand to her heart and then extended it toward him, a gesture that needed no translation. It was thanks, offered with a formality that elevated the simple meal into something approaching ceremony. Thomas nodded in response, understanding that something significant had passed between them in the sharing of food and shelter. As darkness settled fully over the prairie outside, he realized that whatever tomorrow might bring, this night had already changed something fundamental about his understanding of kindness, solitude, and the unexpected ways that human connections could form across the deepest divides. Thomas had prepared a bed for his unexpected guest in what had once been intended as a second bedroom, a space that Sarah had hoped would one day house the children they never had. Now it served as storage for farm equipment and the accumulated possessions of a man who couldn't bear to throw away reminders of his former life. He cleared it as best he could, laying out clean blankets and ensuring the small window was properly shuttered against the cold night air. The young woman accepted this accommodation with the same formal gratitude she had shown for the food, touching her hand to her heart and bowing her head slightly in a gesture that Thomas was beginning to recognize as part of her natural dignity. She kept his jacket wrapped around her shoulders, and he noticed that she seemed reluctant to let it go even when settling in for sleep. Sleep, however, proved elusive for Thomas. He lay in his own bed, listening to the familiar sounds of his house at night, the settling of wooden beams, the whisper of wind around the eaves, the distant calls of coyotes across the prairie. But tonight, these familiar sounds were joined by something new. The almost inaudible presence of another person, someone whose very existence in his home seemed to change the quality of the silence. He found himself thinking about Sarah and how she would have handled this situation. Sarah had possessed an intuitive understanding of people that Thomas had always admired but never quite mastered. She would have known somehow what the right thing to do was, would have navigated the complexities of offering help to someone from a different culture without making his guest feel either threatened or patronized. More troubling was Thomas's awareness that his simple act of kindness might have consequences he couldn't foresee. Relations between white settlers and Native Americans in the Oklahoma Territory were complex and often tense, governed by an intricate web of treaties, government policies, and mutual misunderstandings that had been building for decades. By offering shelter to this young woman, Thomas might have unwittingly inserted himself into conflicts and obligations he didn't understand. But every time these practical concerns arose in his mind, they were countered by the memory of her eyes, the wariness. Yes, but also the intelligence and strength he had seen there. This was not someone to be pitied or feared, but rather someone to be respected. And respect, Thomas had learned from his marriage to Sarah, sometimes required actions that looked like risks to outside observers but felt like moral necessities to those who took them. Dawn came with the kind of crystalline clarity that Oklahoma autumns were famous for, the air so clean and cold it almost hurt to breathe. Thomas was up early, as was his habit, tending to his animals and beginning the daily tasks that kept his small farm functioning. His chickens needed feeding, his cow required milking, and there were always repairs that demanded attention. He was surprised to discover that his guest was already awake, sitting on the front porch of the farmhouse, still wrapped in his jacket, watching the sunrise with an expression of profound concentration. She had somehow managed to wash her face and hands, probably at the pump by the well, and had braided her long hair into a neat plait that revealed the strong lines of her face and neck. "Morning," Thomas said quietly, not wanting to disturb what seemed like a moment of private reflection. She turned toward him and, for the first time since her arrival, offered what might have been the beginning of a smile. It transformed her face completely, revealing a warmth and humor that her wariness had hidden. She stood gracefully, moving with less pain than the night before, and began to remove his jacket from her shoulders. "No," Thomas said quickly, realizing she intended to return it. "Keep it, until you don't need it anymore." She paused in the act of shrugging out of the jacket, her eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she pulled it back, around her shoulders, and touched her hand to her heart, in that gesture of formal thanks that Thomas was learning to recognize as profoundly meaningful rather than merely polite. Thomas went about his morning chores with his guest watching from the porch, and he found himself strangely comforted by her presence. It wasn't conversation. She still hadn't spoken a single word, but it was companionship of a kind he had forgotten he missed. Someone else sharing his small world, witnessing the simple routines that made up his days. When he came back from the barn carrying a bucket of fresh milk, he found her standing near his garden examining the late fall vegetables with obvious interest. She pointed to his turnips and then to herself, raising her eyebrows in what was clearly a question. "You know about farming?" Thomas asked. In response, she walked to where his shovel leaned against the fence and began to demonstrate proper technique for harvesting root vegetables, her movements quick and expert. Within minutes, she had gathered more turnips than Thomas typically managed in an hour, selecting them with an eye for quality and ripeness that spoke of considerable experience. As they worked together in the garden, their first truly collaborative effort, Thomas began to understand that his guest was not just a young woman in need of temporary shelter. She was someone with skills, knowledge, and strength that complemented his own. The realization was both humbling and oddly exciting, reminding him of the way he and Sarah had worked together, each contributing different abilities to their shared enterprise. But even as they settled into this comfortable rhythm of cooperation, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful morning was temporary. Something in the quality of light, or perhaps in the way the wind moved across the prairie, suggested that change was coming. His guest seemed to feel it, too, pausing occasionally in her work to scan the horizon with those intelligent, watchful eyes. Neither of them could have anticipated how dramatically that change would announce itself, or how completely it would transform Thomas's understanding of the simple kindness he had offered the evening before. The sound that broke the peaceful silence of Thomas McKenna's farm was unlike anything he had ever heard, a low, rhythmic thunder that seemed to rise from the earth itself and roll across the Oklahoma prairie like an approaching storm. It was the sound of many horses moving together, their hooves creating a percussion that spoke of discipline, purpose, and unmistakable power. Thomas dropped the armload of firewood he had been carrying and turned toward the source of the sound, his heart beginning to race with the sudden realization that his quiet morning was about to become something far more complicated. Beside him, his unnamed guest stood perfectly still, Her posture transformed from the relaxed cooperation of their garden work into something resembling military alertness. The dust cloud appeared first, a dark smudge on the eastern horizon that grew larger and more defined with each passing moment. Then came the figures themselves, riders emerging from the morning mist like materializations from some ancient legend, their silhouettes creating a line across the landscape that seemed to stretch impossibly far in both directions. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered, his mouth suddenly dry as desert sand. There had to be 200 of them, maybe more. Native American warriors mounted on horses that moved with the kind of precision that only came from years of training and absolute trust between rider and mount. Even at a distance, Thomas could see that they were armed, lances and rifles glinting in the morning sunlight, but their formation suggested purpose rather than immediate attack. The young woman beside him stepped forward slightly, and Thomas noticed that her entire demeanor had changed. The wariness was still there, but it was joined now by something that looked almost like anticipation. She raised her right hand above her head in what was clearly a signal, and Thomas saw several of the distant riders mirror the gesture. "They're here for you," Thomas said, though it wasn't really a question. She turned to look at him, and for the first time since her arrival, she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the careful pronunciation of someone speaking in a language that wasn't her first choice. "They are here because of you," she said. "Because of what you did." Thomas felt his knees go slightly weak. The full implications of his situation began to dawn on him with the clarity of approaching disaster. He had offered shelter to someone important enough to merit a search party of 200 warriors, someone whose disappearance had mobilized what looked like an entire tribal nation, someone whose safety was apparently worth the kind of military operation that could start wars. "Who are you?" he asked, though part of him was no longer sure he wanted to know the answer. "I am called Morning Star," she replied, her English careful but confident. "I am the daughter of Chief Burning Sky of the Cherokee Nation. And you, Thomas McKenna, are the man who protected the honor of a chief's daughter when she was alone and vulnerable in a hostile land." The riders were close enough now that Thomas could make out individual faces, and what he saw there wasn't the bloodthirsty hostility that frontier newspapers had trained him to expect. Instead, he saw something far more complex and potentially more dangerous. Respect mixed with curiosity, and beneath both, the unmistakable presence of men who had come prepared for war but hoping for peace. At the center of the approaching formation rode a man whose bearing immediately identified him as the leader. He was perhaps 60 years old, his long gray hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the morning light. His posture in the saddle, speaking of decades of command and the kind of natural authority that didn't require demonstration to be recognized. "Your father," Thomas said, and it wasn't a question. Morning Star nodded. "He has been searching for me since I was taken 3 days ago by men who thought to use me as leverage against our people. I escaped from them yesterday morning, but I was injured and lost. Without your jacket, without the food and shelter you provided." She paused, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made Thomas understand that whatever happened next would be determined by decisions made in the next few minutes. "They could have killed you for helping me," Morning Star continued. "My people would have understood that you were a white farmer who chose to aid an enemy's daughter. But they also understand that you chose to see me as a human being in need rather than as a political symbol. That kind of recognition creates obligations that go beyond simple gratitude." The lead rider, Chief Burning Sky, had raised his hand, and the entire formation came to a halt approximately 100 yards from Thomas's farmhouse. The precision of their stop was impressive and more than a little intimidating, suggesting military discipline of the highest order. But Thomas noticed that while they were clearly armed, none of the weapons were aimed in his direction. Morning Star began walking toward the assembled warriors, her movements formal and ceremonial. Thomas found himself walking beside her, not because he had been invited, but because something about the moment seemed to require his presence. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, but his mind was surprisingly clear. Whatever was about to happen would determine not just his immediate fate, but possibly the nature of relationships between his small community and the Cherokee Nation for years to come. As they approached Chief Burning Sky, Thomas noticed that the older man's eyes never left his face, studying him with the kind of attention usually reserved for puzzles that required solving. There was no hostility in that gaze, but there was evaluation of the most serious kind, the assessment, of a leader trying to determine whether the man before him was worthy of the trust his daughter had apparently placed in him. When they were close enough for conversation, Morning Star spoke first, her words in Cherokee carrying the formal cadences of someone making an official report to a superior. Chief Burning Sky listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each sentence. When she finished, he turned his full attention to Thomas. "Thomas McKenna," he said, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "My daughter tells me that you offered her your jacket when she was cold, your food when she was hungry, and your shelter when she was alone. She tells me that you asked nothing in return, and that you treated her with the respect due to any human being in need of help." Thomas swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "I did what anyone should do." Chief Burning Sky smiled, and Thomas was surprised to see genuine warmth in the expression. That, Mr. McKenna, is exactly why we are here. Chief Burning Sky dismounted from his horse with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life in the saddle, his movements those of someone accustomed to command but secure enough in his authority to move without haste. As his feet touched the ground, the entire formation of warriors followed suit in perfect unison, creating a sound like distant thunder as 200 men dismounted. Simultaneously, Thomas had never felt smaller or more aware of his own mortality than he did standing in the center of this extraordinary gathering. Yet as Chief Burning Sky approached, Thomas noticed that the older man's hands were empty of weapons, his posture formal but not threatening. Whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be the massacre that Thomas's racing heart had initially anticipated. In our culture, Chief Burning Sky said, stopping just close enough for comfortable conversation, there are laws older than the treaties your government makes and breaks with such regularity. These are laws written not on paper, but in the hearts of people who understand that some debts transcend politics and racial boundaries. Morning Star stepped forward, positioning herself slightly between her father and Thomas, her bearing that of someone prepared to act as both translator and mediator. My father wants you to understand, she said, that what you did for me was not just personal kindness. In Cherokee tradition, I am considered sacred not just because I am his daughter, but because of my status within our people. I am unmarried. I am trained in the old ways of healing and ceremony, and I carry the bloodline that connects our present to our ancestors. Thomas felt his mouth go dry as the implications of her words began to sink in. I didn't know. I just saw someone who needed help. Exactly, Chief Burning Sky replied, his tone suggesting that Thomas had just stated something profoundly important rather than merely obvious. You saw a human being in need. You did not see an opportunity for political gain, or a chance to curry favor with our people, or even a way to prove your own virtue to others. You simply acted from the heart, as a man should act when confronted with another person's suffering. One of the younger warriors stepped forward, carrying something that Thomas initially thought might be a weapon, but quickly realized was something far more significant. It was a pipe of carved stone and polished wood, its surface decorated with intricate symbols that spoke of ceremonial importance and great age. This pipe belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, Chief Burning Sky explained, accepting the sacred object with obvious reverence. It has been used to seal treaties that lasted generations, to mark adoptions that created bonds stronger than blood, and to recognize acts of honor that deserve to be remembered long after the actors are gone. Thomas Ohm watched in fascination and growing apprehension as Chief Burning Sky began the ritual of filling the pipe with a mixture of tobacco and other herbs that filled the air with an aroma. Unlike anything Thomas had ever smelled, the scent was earthy and complex, carrying notes that seemed to connect the present moment to something ancient and enduring. Mr. McKenna, Chief Burning Sky continued as he worked, my daughter's honor is more precious to me than my own life. When she was taken by those who would use her as a tool against our people, I was prepared to wage war to get her back. I had already sent word to allied tribes, had begun gathering warriors for a campaign that would have painted this territory red with blood. The pipe was lit now, small wisps of smoke rising into the clear morning air and dispersing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the smoke itself carried meaning. Chief Burning Sky drew deeply and then released the smoke in 4 directions, north, south, east, and west, before continuing his explanation. But then my daughter returned to us, not as a victim rescued by force of arms, but as a person whose dignity had been preserved by the kindness of a stranger. She returned wearing your jacket, carrying the memory of your food, strengthened by your shelter. She returned with stories of a white man who saw past the color of her skin to the human being beneath. Thomas found himself thinking of Sarah and how she would have reacted to this extraordinary scene. She had always believed that small acts of kindness rippled outward in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Looking around at the assembled warriors, at the ceremonial pipe, and Morning Star's face glowing with what looked like pride, Thomas began to understand that his simple gesture had indeed created ripples far beyond anything he could have imagined. In our law, Chief Burning Sky continued, offering the pipe to Thomas, when someone preserves the sacred honor of our people without seeking reward, they become family. Not by blood, but by choice and deed. The bond created is not temporary, but eternal. It passes from generation to generation, creating obligations and protections that cannot be broken by time or circumstance. Thomas accepted the pipe with trembling hands, understanding instinctively that this moment was transforming him from a simple Oklahoma farmer into something he didn't yet fully comprehend. The pipe was heavier than he had expected, not just physically, but spiritually, as if it carried the weight of all the ceremonies it had witnessed over the generations. When you smoke this pipe with us, Chief Burning Sky said, you become our brother. Morning Star becomes your sister in spirit, and my people become your people. If you are ever in need, we will come to your aid as we would for any member of our family. And if we are in need, we know that we can call upon your honor as we would call upon any Cherokee warrior. Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him. 200 warriors who had ridden across the territory not to wage war, but to witness an adoption ceremony that would bind him to their people in ways he was still trying to understand. He thought of his quiet life, his simple routines, his long years of solitude following Sarah's death. Then he thought of Morning Star, shivering in the cold, of the trust she had placed in a stranger's kindness, and of the dignity with which she had accepted his simple offering of warmth and shelter. Thomas raised the pipe to his lips and drew deeply, feeling the smoke fill his lungs with flavors that tasted like ceremony and commitment and the beginning of a new chapter in his life that he never could have anticipated. The ceremony that followed Thomas's acceptance of the sacred pipe was unlike anything he had witnessed in his 52 years of life. What had begun as a simple act of offering shelter to a stranger had evolved into a formal adoption ritual that seemed to engage not just the assembled warriors, but the very landscape itself. Chief Burning Sky had produced a wooden bowl filled with what Morning Star quietly explained was a mixture of sacred earth from various Cherokee holy sites, combined with water from springs considered blessed by generations of their people. As Thomas watched, several of the elder warriors came forward to add their own contributions to the mixture. Small pinches of soil from battlefields where their ancestors had fought with honor, drops of water from streams that had sustained their communities during times of hardship. This earth contains the memory of our people, Chief Burning Sky explained as he began to mix the contents of the bowl with his hands. When we mark your forehead with this mixture, you carry our history with you. You become connected not just to those of us who are here today, but to all who came before and all who will come after. Thomas knelt as instructed, feeling the soft Oklahoma soil beneath his knees and the weight of 200 pairs of eyes observing his every movement. When Chief Burning Sky applied the sacred mixture to his forehead, the sensation was cool and somehow deeply comforting, as if he were being welcomed into something that had been waiting for him his entire life without his knowing it. Morning Star stepped forward then, carrying what Thomas initially thought was a simple piece of cloth, but quickly recognized as something far more significant. It was a shirt of the softest deer hide he had ever felt, decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. The patterns were geometric, but somehow organic, suggesting both the mathematical precision of natural growth and the artistic vision of someone who understood beauty as a form of spiritual expression. This was made by the women of our village, Morning Star explained, after word came that someone had preserved my honor. They worked through 3 days and nights to complete it, each woman contributing her finest work. It is not just clothing, but a symbol of the gratitude of our entire community. As Thomas accepted the shirt, he noticed that several of the younger warriors were smiling, not with mockery, but with genuine pleasure, as if they were witnessing something that brought them joy. One of them, a man who appeared to be about Thomas's own age, stepped forward with an expression of obvious eagerness. "I am called Standing Wolf," he said in careful English. "I am brother to Chief Burning Sky, and now I am brother to you as well. My wife, she is, how do you say, very happy to have a new brother to worry about and boss around." This comment produced general laughter from the assembled warriors, and Thomas realized that what he was witnessing wasn't just a formal ceremony, but a genuine celebration. These men hadn't ridden across the territory out of grim duty, but because they wanted to be present for something they considered joyous and significant. Chief Burning Sky raised his hands for quiet, and the laughter gradually subsided into respectful attention. "Thomas McKenna," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone of official pronouncement, "you are now Thomas McKenna of the Cherokee Nation. You carry our name as we carry yours. Your farm is under our protection, your cattle are our responsibility to guard, and your safety is as important to us as the safety of any man born into our people." The practical implications of this statement were staggering. Thomas's small farm, which had always felt vulnerable and isolated, was suddenly under the protection of one of the most formidable military forces in the Oklahoma Territory. His livestock, his crops, his very person were now considered part of Cherokee interests, defended by the same warriors who had successfully resisted federal troops in conflicts across the southeastern United States. But even more overwhelming than the practical benefits was the emotional reality of what had just occurred. For 3 years, since Sarah's death, Thomas had lived with a loneliness so complete that he had sometimes wondered if he were slowly disappearing from the world, becoming less real with each day of solitary existence. Now, in the space of a single morning, he had acquired not just friends or allies, but a family that numbered in the thousands. Morning Star approached him again, this time carrying his own jacket, the worn wool coat he had placed around her shoulders the evening before. But it looked different now, somehow transformed by the night she had spent wrapped in it. She had cleaned it carefully, mended the small tears that years of farm work had created, and somehow restored it to something approaching its original appearance. "Your jacket saved my life," she said simply. "Not just from the cold, but from despair. When I was lost and injured, when I had begun to think that I would die alone in the wilderness, you appeared and showed me that kindness still existed in a world that had shown me mainly cruelty." She paused, looking down at the jacket in her hands. I want to return it to you, but I want you to know that part of me will always be wrapped in its warmth. Whenever you wear it, you will carry the gratitude of a daughter who was welcomed home because of your generosity. Thomas accepted his jacket with hands that were no longer trembling, though his eyes had begun to water with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The wool felt familiar beneath his fingers, but it also felt changed, invested now with a significance it had never possessed when it was simply a piece of practical clothing, designed to keep out the Oklahoma cold. As the ceremony concluded and the warriors began to remount their horses for the journey back to their homes, Thomas realized that his life had been divided into two distinct chapters, before Morning Star appeared at his gate and after. The second chapter was just beginning, and he had no idea what it might contain, but for the first time in 3 years, he was genuinely excited to find out.